have our roundtable on business cycles, and we have with us Dr. Edward Nell. He's the Malcolm B. Smith Professor of Economics at the New School of Social Research in New York. And we have Professor Korkut Erturk. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Utah. And today we're going to be talking about business cycles in the economy. And so the first question we probably want to ask is, what do we mean by a business cycle and what are its functions? And perhaps, Professor Nell, you could tell us something about that.
Well, since the 18th century, people have observed fluctuations in the economy. Prices, output, employment, and other major variables fluctuate in a regular pattern. Throughout the 19th century, perhaps every 8 to 10 years, there would be a boom followed by a crash. After the crash, the economy would, in a sense, gather itself together, excuse me, and begin a long, slow upswing. This would then turn into a rapid expansion, leading to a speculative boom and then a sudden, sharp contraction. And this regular pattern has been observed for perhaps 150 years. Mm-hmm. This is what we mean by a business cycle. It's changed a bit from time to time, but there is a statistical regularity and a permanence to it in the whole of capitalist industrial history.
Mm-hmm. So if business cycles reoccur periodically, I mean, do they have some function in the economy? Is there something useful we get from them?
Well, there really is. It's very important in a sense because the business cycle means an opportunity for competitive markets to bring about innovations and to change the technology, the way business is done, the institutions of business. And in a sense, it's a kind of creative destruction. Mm-hmm. What happens is that the weaker firms are driven into bankruptcy, and the strong firms consolidate. It is a process of selection, almost analogous to natural selection. One might call it market selection. Mm-hmm. But it has some very dangerous characteristics too.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because you point out that business cycles are caused by the behavior of markets, yet when we read the textbook, we often get the impression that markets are these harmonious entities that lead to this wonderful world and that they adjust and bring about these equilibriums. But yet you're saying markets fundamentally are underlying business cycles.
Well,
is that what you're trying to say?
When you think about the business cycle, mm-hmm. when you look at the fierce struggles that lead to market expansion and then to booms, and when you see the sometimes predatory actions that are taken by firms taking over others, stealing their markets, driving them into bankruptcy, and at the same time bringing about an enormous rise in the general standard of living, followed by a terrible crash and what is sometimes referred to euphemistically as a shakeout. Shaking out, well, it's really shaking people out of their jobs and shaking business owners out of their assets. Mm-hmm. It doesn't look very harmonious, and it may be that, well, this is one way of looking at the economy. Perhaps the textbooks give us another way, but it is certainly important to remember that this is, in a sense, an evolutionary way of thinking about the economy, the evolution of technology, of investment, of organizations and institutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there any historical change in the business cycle? I mean, is it the same for every period of time in
I think it's changed its character, but I want to say something mm-hmm. that can sort of tie it up to what we get in the textbooks. The textbook version of what markets do is, if you like, an idealized picture. But if you look at the business cycle, ups and downs, and what happens in the context of what Dr. Nell said, you have some sort of a rough mechanism of allocation. That's really what goes on. think about it.
So markets are just there to say, well,
Yes,
now if we
nothing.
want this, it's just a way to get resources to flow and
That's
produce.
right. How do you
what we
channel the
want.
resources from old firms that are stuck with old technologies and what have you to the new vibrant firms? If when you have a business expansion, usually it's accompanied with credit expansion, so everyone is getting purchasing power. And as long as the economy can accommodate that, that is, capacity utilization rates in the economy overall are not excessive, that's fine. But at some point, there are only so many resources to go around. Coming back to the textbook definition, right? The allocation of scarce resources. So some shakeout has to take place. And that usually takes place, it begins, not always, but in most cases, with a financial collapse. And those financial difficulties lead to a chain of bankruptcies. So you have one firm going bankrupt after the other, which is, of course, horrible thing if you happen to be a laid-off worker or if you happen to be the owner of the business. But from the aggregate point of view, that's how the resources those firms would have claims on are being channeled to the survivors. It's like the law of the jungle, in fact, and the survivors are the ones who will strike new paths and will be more vibrant. Now, you get a very idealized picture of this, and in the textbooks and introductory courses, we try to forget about what happens to the people who get sidelined during this process. So, minus the idealization, some allocation.
You're saying something quite different. When I read my introductory textbook, you tend to see business cycles as a result of these exogenous factors. That the economy is right on track, there's full employment, and then wham, something comes, hits it, and we get a business cycle. But you're saying something different. You're saying there's deeper underlying processes that actually generate periodic business cycles.
Right.
And that's quite different because it says, in a sense, they're inevitable. They're not a result of random events or bad policy, but they're a result of the process
The
of...
way the system works, I think. It's a different conception of competition, in a way. Competition is often presented in the textbooks as some kind of harmonious meeting of minds and balancing of interests. This is, in a sense, saying that competition is the race to get the monopoly. You only arrive at equilibrium when all the big fish have eaten all the little fish. This is a different conception of competition and of equilibrium, and it leads to a struggle. And this struggle leads to an expansion, and then, as it runs up against the limitations of what's available, to a crash. And this is built into the system. It's the way it works.
So give me an analogy, though. I like this idea of the big fish eating the little fish. Give me an example of how this actually works, a tangible example of what goes on.
Well,
who's the big fish and who's the little fish? And what happens when all the little fish are gone?
I mean, just making an example from more recent history, this whole takeover wave in the 1980s can be thought of a process of market consolidation. And there has been periods in the history of the United States and other advanced countries where such waves have taken place. In the 1970s, we'll probably come back to this when we try to look at long-term changes in structural change. As fundamental changes were taking place in the way in which the world economy functioned, certain U.S. companies, which were very successful in the past, did not catch up or did not keep up. So they became vulnerable to takeover bids. So there was so much waste that was involved in all that episode. And a lot of unproductive people became very rich for basically exploiting these opportunities. And a lot of people were ripped off of their pension funds and what have you. A lot of contracts were, in fact, not honored as a result of this process. So that's the downside. and that should not be belittled by any means. But at the same time, it was the way in which the markets, in their clumsy way, again a picture that is quite different from what we get from textbooks, could bring about a change. It's like this huge ocean liner changing course. And in fact, in the night after the 1980s, the way business is done in the United States fundamentally changed. And today we read about downsizing, how firms and corporations have changed the way they manage their business, globalization, and so forth and so forth. So that's one example that is quite close to our present time.
Well, now this is interesting because I know that in the work that you do, you talk about long waves. And usually we think of business cycles as just short disruptions to this long-term growth. But now in your work, you're looking at their long periods of economic behavior that then changes. And you believe that we're in the downside of a long wave beginning after 1970.
Well, let me go back just a little bit. I wanted to suggest a couple of other examples.
Okay.
There were the railroad booms of the late 19th century and early 20th century. These were building booms, expansions. They drove much of the rest of the economy. And there were then consolidations as the railroads put each other out of business, as the Wall Street speculation in railroad bonds and stocks consolidated the different companies. We started with many, many different automobile companies. In the early part of the 20th century, there was an automobile boom in the 20s. And then we found a consolidation as the number of companies shrank and they got larger. We have repeated examples of business in which a large number of small companies develop a market and develop a technology and end up as a small number of large companies. We're seeing perhaps something like this in computers today. And when these are large enough and dynamic enough, they tend to drive the economy. And they tend to drive the economy over a substantial period of time. That's what I think we mean by a long wave. It's the introduction of a new technology or a new set of technologies and a reorganization of the economy. And there tends to be an expansionary phase, and there tends to be a consolidation phase and a shift in the working of the economy.
Can you give me...
But there is also this, what we might call a market-driven cycle of investment, which is shorter and which takes place within the framework of the longer expansion or contraction. So you'll still have cycles, the short cycle with the expansion, the boom, the crash, the contraction, the slump, but it will be much more pronounced in the boom phase if it is in an upswing of the long part of the cycle. And if it is in the down, the consolidation and contraction phase of the long cycle, then the booms will be weaker and the slumps longer in the market-driven investment cycle.
Okay, now this is interesting now. Before I ask you about the long wave, I want to ask you one more question about if you feel business cycles are inevitable, these shorter waves. Can you tell me, is there any role for government to address the business cycle, to smooth it out or address when there's unemployment or...
It's a very interesting issue. Much of the justification of government's macroeconomic policy was dealing with the ups and downs of the business cycles. And in the 50s and 60s, these sets of policies, which we called macroeconomic policies, fiscal and monetary policies in some combination, seemed to be very successful. And it was so successful that some economists went to their head and they started writing books about the obsolescence of the business cycle. And all of a sudden the same policies, the same combination of policies, started to fail, starting with the 1970s. I think one of the reasons as to why there is such a discrepancy is that the types of policies that seem to work have worked because it was the expansion phase of the long wave, and you were basically not trying to go against the wind. And those policies have become much more tricky and at times backfired when we entered this different phase in which the system started to work differently. Let me just say one other thing about these short cycles. You know, we said that in the short cycles, the main function is that you have this rough allocation of resources. It's going from the old firms to the new firms, the vibrant firms. But there is evidence to believe that it doesn't necessarily happen like this in every business cycle. And some economists call those business cycles inefficient or unproductive cycles. So the work the business cycles need to do then gets accumulated. So each cycle has more dead wood to clear, so to speak, and it leads to a stagnation of number of technologies. When Dr. Nell was talking about set of technologies, I think it's useful to think of that in terms of a group of interlocking technologies. For instance, in the 50s and the 60s, you had the auto industry, you have the expansion of the suburbia, you have the building of highways, housing industry. You see, all these things were interlocking, and the glue was the cheap oil. And that has come to an end. Now, people think that the chip, the microchip, is the glue around which a number of technologies are interlocking, and some economists call that the information age.
Okay, I want to, just if you briefly could give me characteristics of this long wave since the post-World War II era, the pre-1970, post-1970, and I would like you to then make some comments about how this long wave can describe what's going on in the United States today.
Well, from the end of World War II to really the end of the Nixon administration, the economy, the U.S. economy and the world economy functioned pretty well. Growth rates were high, productivity rates of increase were high, Keynesian-type policies appeared to work, interventionist policies, manipulation of interest rates, deficit spending when it was useful, little surpluses when they seemed to be appropriate, inflation could be controlled. But this was all built on a foundation which partly is that described by Dr. Ertug as a set of interrelated technologies. It also concerns the changing character of government, the changing size of government in relation to the rest of the economy, and as well the fact that debt, private debt, had been very much reduced during the war and its immediate aftermath, so that corporate indebtedness was very low. In addition, in the United States and in Great Britain, policies were built around presenting a kind of reward to the millions of men and women who had served in the armed services. So the Veterans Administration administered a program of veterans benefits which provided mortgages, car loans, medical care, a variety of educational benefits and so on, that sent these young people, many of whom were drawn from quite poor backgrounds, sent them into the middle class. And this provided a market for the new corporate producers of consumer durables. Every new household that was formed needed refrigerators, stoves, vacuum cleaners, carpets, furniture, asphalt driveway for their garage, and so on, and a new house. So there was a consumer durables boom, which was partly fueled by this set of policies. In a sense, you can think of it as a redistribution. A group, a segment of society was lifted from a, relatively speaking, somewhat impoverished and insecure level to a more secure level, and that provided a long-term stimulus to demand at the very same time that new technologies came in to provide a new ways of producing and call for new investment. This worked until, in a sense, it was exhausted. And we went into a phase in which many aspects of the economy all don't work quite so well following the 1970s and the oil shocks.
Well, what exactly happened in 1970? I mean, tell me how this change occurred. I mean, post-World War II, we have this image that things were going well. And then they changed. Now, is that because of government or what? I mean, people tend to blame government for these problems that we've experienced in the last 2 decades. And could you comment on that? Are these outcomes a result of government's explicit policies, or is there something else?
No, I think these changes are built into the economy. Government has to adapt its policies, and if it doesn't, it may indeed either fail to do the job or in some cases make things worse. But the generalized tendency to blame government for our problems, I think, is scapegoating. It's a little bit ridiculous.
Well, since we're almost done, I want to get this question to you. I've read some of your work, and you're one of the few that says something quite different than what we hear every day in the news. And to quote you, you said, "The problem is not that government has become too large and is growing too fast, as is commonly believed, but that it is too small and has been growing too slowly." Now, this is quite different, and can you explain why you're saying this and what you see as the role of government in addressing the issues in the American economy today? And I'll give you the last 2 minutes.
The United States, has the lowest ratio of total government spending on goods and services and on welfare and transfers to total output. Ratio of government to total output. It's the lowest in the United States of the 18 major advanced capitalist industrial economies. Government spending does a job. Government spending does everything from building highways to regulating airlines to building airports to subsidizing medical care, education, police, and so on. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, can we do all of these jobs more efficiently than any other industrial economy? And the answer is evident in our social statistics. We're the richest country, but we have one of the highest ratios of infant mortality, rates of infant mortality. We are one of the richest economies, and we have a temperate climate, and we're not very crowded compared to the European countries, but we don't live as long on average. We have terrible social statistics in relation to child abuse, to crime. We have a larger percentage of our population in jail than any other major industrial economy. Maybe we aren't spending enough on those collective activities which are necessary to make an advanced economy work. That is, I think, one of our central problems.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank both of you for coming today, and I hope you enjoyed the roundtable.
Thank you.